Hello and welcome to the National Immigration Forum's Leading the Way panel on mayors and migration. My name is Lomi Kriel and I'm a reporter with ProPublica and Texas Tribune, focused largely on immigration issues. And today I'm so honored to be with these two fascinating speakers who have dealt with so many migration issues in their city. Margo has served as mayor of El Paso since June 2017. Overseeing a challenging period in his city's history, it was ground zero of many of the Trump administration's immigration policies and the site of the 2019 Walmart massacre that killed 23 people. He has helped found the Regional Economic Development Corps, now known as the Borderplex Alliance, and also serves as vice chair for border security on the U.S. Conference of Mayors Criminal and Social Justice Committee. Thank you so much for joining us, Mayor Margo. Mayor Marvin Rees joins us from Bristol in the United Kingdom, where he became the continent's first mayor of a major city to come from Black African heritage when he was elected in 2016. He's a Yale World Fellow, graduate of Operation Black Vote, and a former BBC journalist and public health worker. He oversees a city with 16% of its population born outside the UK and more than 91 languages spoken on its streets. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi.
So to start, I'd like to ask both of you how national governments and leaders have failed to address migration issues and how such failures may have helped lead to a backlash both in the US, the UK, and Europe. We can start with you, Mayor Rees, if you would like.
Well, I think that failure goes back many, many years, whether we're looking at the push factors of migration or the pull factors. Certainly in the 90s, I was working on campaigns where we were looking at those factors that we were contributing to: climate change, debt, poverty, political instability that drove people from their countries of origin and put them on the path, which is a double injustice, right? They're in horrific circumstances, sometimes to do with things that we've done with our foreign policy, and then they're treated as though they're exploiters and enemies as they approach our countries here. So I think that failure to deal with push factors has been massively significant. The other thing I would say has been a failure is to tackle the challenges faced by what you might call the domestic population. In the UK, we have social immobility. We have people who were born in the UK who are faced with amongst the lowest levels of social mobility in OECD. That sense of hopelessness that can then take root within the wider population, by definition, is there to be exploited to make people more hostile to migrants because they're feeling that they haven't got any chance as well. The other thing I would just add is we've had our flirtations with nativism and what does it mean to be British. And I would add that some of those conversations around Britishness have made me feel uncomfortable. And my family go back in this country for centuries. And all those things have just really not helped.
Thank you. Mayor Margo, tell us how you see that in El Paso and in the US side.
Well, I've said on numerous occasions that I think our immigration problems go back well over 30 years. They're owned by both houses of Congress and both parties. There's been no action for any significance since 1986 when Reagan did amnesty. And we have this piecemeal laws and changes that have occurred over the last 30 years that have not done anything related to a national policy on immigration reform. We got caught up in El Paso actually in October of 18. I received a call from the border sector chief of the Customs and Border Protection to tell me that that ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, their holding areas were overwhelmed because of the Wilberforce Anti-Trafficking Victims Act that was enacted under the Bush administration, which was designed to give unaccompanied minors basically unfettered entrance into the United States through a port of entry coming from 3 countries contiguous to Mexico: Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Did not apply to Mexico. And then the court started interpreting by saying, and the purpose of that law was proper. The concern was that if we didn't allow these unaccompanied minors to enter, that they would be used by the drug cartels or in human trafficking. And remember, this was the height of the drug cartel wars in 08 and 09 in Mexico, when Juarez, Mexico, our sister city, was listed as the murder capital of the world. So it was a very magnanimous gesture on the part of our legislature under the Bush administration. But then the court started interpreting it by saying that, number one, it didn't just apply to unaccompanied minors, it could apply to families. And then number two, that you could enter anywhere along the border and not just a port of entry. And so it created a mass influx. The Customs and Border Protection were overwhelmed. Our holding areas along the border historically were never designed for families. They were designed historically for unaccompanied male Mexicans who were coming over to get work and then send money back home and then go back home. And so it just was a confluence of a number of things, and it was I don't want to call it a perfect storm, but it was a major storm, and we became known nationwide and worldwide as ground zero for immigration. And that was because when they were overwhelmed, we had an agreement with CBP that they would let us know after they processed these immigrants and released them. They would give us 24-hour notice so we could use our NGOs, primarily one called the Annunciation House here. And the way the process worked is these migrants, after processed through Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, ICE, they would be released in El Paso. We would make sure they were transported to this NGO, and their volunteers help contact their sponsors. And the sponsors could be family members or friends or anybody. And then these sponsors paid for either bus fare or airfare, and these migrants were transferred all over the United States. They weren't just here in El Paso. In fact, very rarely did they stay here in El Paso. So that was usually 24 to 48 hours max, and it could be 72 hours or longer if there were health issues, which we also took care of. But that created that was the problem. And we had one glitch on December the 23rd of 2018, where the CBP failed and ICE failed to notify us, and they released a number of migrants at our Greyhound bus station. And then that hit the national news and the international news, and that's where it went from there on. But the whole issue was the bottom line. We weren't prepared. We've done nothing about it. And it's a political football that's been kicked back and forth between both houses of Congress and both parties for too dadgum long.
And I think what your explanation there about what happened in El Paso when you guys became overwhelmed really gets at is how the demographics of migrants that come to the U.S. has changed so dramatically. And as you said, the system was built for mostly single Mexican men coming here to work. And in the past few years, we've seen instead families with small children coming from Central America, and the system just isn't set up for that. Mayor Margo, I wanted you to address this interconnectedness between El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. I've been there, both cities, many times, and I'm always struck by how, seamless that connection is. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about that relationship and what insight it may offer Americans who are not familiar with the U.S.-Mexico border.
We're a region that goes back over 350 years, 361 to be exact, to 1659 with the founding of the mission in Juarez. And that was our original population center. We did not have much migration north of the Rio Grande River until 1848 when Fort Bliss came to El Paso. So we've been here 100 years before the United States was ever even founded. We've been through wars and revolutions and everything else. But we are one region. El Paso is the largest U.S. city on the Mexican border. It is the 6th largest city in the state of Texas. We have 6 of the 28 bridges that go from Texas to Mexico. And we're the 20th largest city in the United States. And most people have rarely been to El Paso, don't know where we are or what we're about. but we're a region of 2.7 million people when you count Juarez, Mexico, El Paso, and southern New Mexico. We're an average age of 31. So you cannot stand on one of our taller buildings in El Paso and look south, and you cannot tell where El Paso ends and Juarez begins. And that's the way it is. We've had commerce, culture, and families on both sides of the border for well over 350 years. And that makes us totally unique. People think of San Diego being on the border with Tijuana. They're not. They're 15 or 20 miles away. We are intrinsically tied culturally and with family and commerce, and have been for, as I say, well over 350 years. So as we deal with immigration and as we deal with COVID, we're intertwined.
And on that note, President Trump campaigned on building a big, beautiful wall, and that's, of course, been a huge issue the past few years. And many border mayors, you included, have noted that their cities are among the safest on the U.S. side of the border and have been before border fencing was put in place. I'm wondering if you can talk just a little bit about what role a fence or wall can play and how that may not combat some of these migration issues.
Well, the problem is, all right, as a sovereign nation, you do need to control your borders. And everyone will agree that to a certain extent, some physical barriers are prudent and proper for the control of a sovereign nation. I call it a fence. It's not a wall. You can see through it. What has been constructed in El Paso was simply a reconstruction of a former chain link fence that was there before. We are one of the safest cities in the United States, and we still maintain our position as one of the safest cities in the United States, according to the crime statistics as reported to the Uniform Crime Statistics report of the FBI, even with our August 3rd tragedy of last year. And we were one of the safest cities during the drug cartel wars in Mexico. So the fence didn't, from my perspective, didn't have as much to do with immigration as it did. It stopped theft. We had issues with vehicles being stolen and theft and things like that. But I don't recall us seeing statistics related to immigration as a real issue. But the fact is, to control your border, and one of the political arguments historically has been, we won't do immigration reform until we know that our borders are protected. Well, my position has always been fine. Have Homeland Security determine exactly what is needed for, quote, enforcement or protection of our borders, and fund it accordingly, and then move on to deal with immigration reform. But it is a logistical impossibility to build a wall, as the president would call it, or a fence, as some of us would call it, from El Paso to Brownsville, Texas. It can't be done. And what people don't realize is that most of Texas is privately owned land. So you have those issues as well. But logistically, it can't. There's technology and other things that need to be done, and fund the proper personnel levels. One of my biggest concerns is that the CBP is never, on the bridges, is not fully staffing our bridges, which creates all kinds of bottlenecks between El Paso and Juarez. And so those are the issues. But the fence that went up was simply a replacement. It wasn't an extension. And most people keep thinking it was this big, massive extension, and it never was.
Mayor Rees, tell us more about the impact of migration on Bristol and how you have handled the last few years of sometimes divisive rhetoric on the issue under Brexit and the Brexit negotiations, and how you think leaders can combat those who scapegoat migrants and refugees, local leaders in particular.
So first of all, the overarching impact of migration on Bristol has been huge. Bristol is a port city. It was one of the 4 biggest ports variously in its history, and that's how it's grown up, along with Liverpool, Hull, London, Cardiff, I would say as well, in Wales. This has been a huge part of the city's history and its connectivity and its wealth has grown up around that fact, and people movement has been key. It's a crossroads city as well. So we sit smack in the middle of London, trip to Cardiff, and then north-south from Birmingham to the south of the country. So actually, when we've been having a conversation around migration in the UK, in Bristol, we talk about international migration, but we also talk about migration within this land too. So my great grandmother was a rural urban migrant, for example, from rural Wiltshire, came into Bristol. My grandfather, my white grandfather, was a son of a Welsh miner who couldn't find work in South Wales. My great grandmother on my mum's side came from Ireland. Before that, was a migrant worker who came from Ireland to South Wales looking for work. And my grandfather ultimately came to Bristol. That just extends itself out to the whole Commonwealth as well. So after the Second World War in particular, major migration into the UK from Asia. And by Asia, I mean the Pakistan, India area, and the Caribbean. Obviously a large number of Jamaicans with the Windrush, because Britain had been blitzed out, bombed out, and it was about coming back to the motherland to help rebuild the UK. So migration has been huge, and people movements have been a huge part of the city's story. So it's always been a contentious issue. As a young person growing up, as I said, my family tree go back. My father came here as a 12-year-old from Jamaica. My white family go back in here centuries. But as a young kid, I was always aware of the question of migration and belonging. It was a kind of well, you're not quite British, are you? Type conversation going on. I am sorry to say that while that has kind of bubbled along in the background, it really has picked up a pace over recent years. I think some of that's to do with people's loss of people struggling with their identity. I think globalization has a bit of an issue to play. You know, who are we? What are we? What does it mean to be British? But I suppose the high points in recent years have been Brexit and the Windrush scandal. So Brexit speaks for itself. We want our country back. Kind of vague ideas that of taking sovereignty back into the UK. My constant point is Brexit is the wrong answer to the right problem. We recognise people have been left behind by the global economy. We recognise people are losing faith in politics, and people are confused about who they are in the world. Brexit isn't going to solve those problems. And with your new president, I think it's going to cause more challenges for the British government in terms of navigating its way through the deal it eventually has not been brokering. The other real scandal recently that points to this has been Windrush, which speaks to the government's kind of double-minded, well, you might call hypocrisy on it. People who came here in the 50s and 60s to help rebuild the country from Jamaica, from the Caribbean, on the ship Windrush, and subsequently were told they were British, had British citizenship, and now being asked for their papers 30, 40 years after the fact. And when they couldn't turn up with the paperwork, were being deported. Absolutely scandalous. I mean, it was a real scandal. So there's been a really kind of, I would say, quite an unsavory atmosphere that's been worsened by the lack of sophistication, really, of our public leaders in talking about who belongs and who doesn't, who belongs, right, and how we're open. I think it's been a real kind of stunted conversation. And it's also been a conversation in which people have been looking for scapegoats to blame for their economic woes, and some politicians have exploited that. I'll just give you an example. I talked to a group of people just a few weeks ago after the Colston statue was toppled, and I talked to some of the people who came up to kind of counter that rally, for want of a better phrase, white working class activists. And I said to him, what is your issue? And he said, we feel like we're losing our city. And I said, well, you are losing your city. The problem is you're losing it to house prices and market forces. You're not losing it to migrants, right? It's that people can't afford to live here anymore. And what we haven't had is a political leadership that's been able to challenge people and take them beyond the superficial analysis, and take them to look at some of the underlying drivers of their own feelings of alienation and marginalization. In terms of what we've done, we've just tried to counter that within the city by focusing on inclusive economic development, by sharing our suggestion that cities are better placed to talk about identity in a multidimensional way. We are an international city. It's part of our brand. It's one of the things that makes us proud. And we're able to talk about that in a way that I think that national governments cannot or will not. So we really push that. Storytelling is important. And it's something that we've really stressed. We have a campaign called We Are Bristol, which is all about that. I'm not saying it solves all the ills, but it is one of the fronts we've really been pushing on.
Yeah, tell us more about that campaign and why you think sometimes local leaders are better positioned on this identity question, because I think that identity question has also played out in the US to a certain extent. And Mayor Margo, I'll follow up on a question with that. But if you can first tell us, Mayor Rees, why you think in some aspects cities are better able to address that.
Well, it might be because in many sense, the inherent, because maybe it's this, nations generally, like Mayor Margo said, nations have hard borders. And I suppose they have to define themselves in discrete terms. We are this, you are that, right? And we have to make the distinction between the two. When I look at the population in Bristol, right, like I say, 180 countries of origin, 92 languages, 45 religions. And I myself, I'm a product of that, right? I'm white, Welsh, English, Irish, and Jamaican heritage. It's all inside me, right? But what's going on in Nigeria right now is of immediate concern to Bristolians, because we have a lot of Nigerians living in Bristol, or like people of Nigerian heritage. What goes on in Lahore is of immediate concern. When there's a flood in Bangladesh, it's of immediate concern. The US elections are a first order concern, not just because of politics, but we have a lot of Americans living here. My wife is an American from Boston. So actually, when I talk about Bristol's interests, I'm not just talking about the interests within this boundary of the authority area of Bristol. If I'm talking about Bristolians, I have to be minded that their brothers, parents, aunts live in countries all around the world. So that sense of their well-being being product of what goes on globally is very, very real and immediate if we choose to recognize it. I think that's something that's available to cities, but also drive cities in a way that national governments don't or cannot so much, without these treaties that are kind of often sometimes more real on paper than they are in lived experience. So I'm not claiming there's any scientific, belt and braces around that, but that's just my sense. We are so international and global in our nature and our culture that it drives us to think about belonging and our well-being in a more multidimensional, a more kind of global way.
Mayor Margo, on the identity question, in 2019, your city had a devastating event occur there. The gunman drove there, killed 23 people, and in this screed that was shared with police, he railed against people of Hispanic heritage. How did that horrific incident, and I was there, I covered it, and I will never forget it. How did the city of El Paso come together after that? And how do you think it shaped or changed some of the views of migration?
We had let me make sure people understand the demographics in El Paso. Our population is 85% Hispanic, 4% Black, and we have multi-generational families on both sides of the border, which is the way it is. We had an evil white supremacist, hate-filled young man come from 700 miles away and reap destruction on us and on who we are. 46 people were injured and 23 died. And I think what amazes people about El Paso is that we have such a warm and friendly and vibrant culture that I remember all of the newscasters from all over the world would say to me before an interview, either before or after, I cannot get over the hospitality of your people. And I think it's kind of, we talk about resilience, and that's kind of an overworked word, especially in the COVID and all this. But I think that we have it kind of embedded in our DNA because of the history I talked about. I mean, we've been here for well over 350 years, so we've seen those wars and revolutions and everything else, and we're survivors. We're continuing, and we're making progress. But it will take time to fully heal from something like that. It was, as I say, it was an attack on us and who we are as a people. But it gets compounded when less than 6 months later we have COVID and the pandemic, and we're dealing with that. And so it's just going to take a while to get it kind of all behind us and moving forward. And we're doing the best we can, and I sense that from those that I talk to. And yes, mayors are a whole lot closer to what's going on than anyone else, and we can get the sense and the pulse and of what is happening. But I think we'll be fine, and we're continuing to work through this. But we're proud of who we are, and we're proud of our heritage. I mean, you talk about immigration. On my father's side, my great-great-grandmother came from Mexico. My great-great-grandfather was settled in 1850 in the Rio Grande Valley. My great-grandmother came from Mexico, and my grandfather didn't speak English till he was 18 and went to the University of Texas at Galveston Medical School and ultimately became an orthopedic surgeon. So, that's just kind of who we are. And I'm appreciative of my heritage, and we are a nation of immigrants. And what I find is that people have misconceptions about Hispanic heritage or work ethics or other things, and our productivity is phenomenal. And we're close-knit, we're family-oriented, and we just have a lot to bring to the table.
Yeah, one of the things that everyone said to me when I was in El Paso covering that horrific event was that this could never have been someone from El Paso who did this because of the city's sort of cultural heritage and relationship with Ciudad Juarez.
I said that from day one in our first press conference, and when we talked about it. That person never would have come from our region, I am convinced.
So you bring up COVID, and I think that's probably a good way to end this discussion. I think we're about running on time. Is what has been the impact of COVID-19 on immigration issues in your region, and what are the challenges that will bring going forward? And we know on the U.S. side of the border, almost no asylum seekers are able to enter now. They're being expelled almost immediately under COVID-19 health order. And the port, situations at the ports of entry have also changed quite a bit. So can both of you tell me how this is played out on a local level and how you think this may go and impact the conversation about this going forward?
Who do you want to go first?
You can go first since we just mentioned El Paso. Why don't you go ahead and start?
As most people know, that the bridges are closed to non-essential personnel and have been since March. So there is no back and forth supposedly by anyone non-essential from Juarez or from Mexico, period. If you're a U.S. citizen or you have papers, you can come across. And if you're a worker in the maquilas and back and forth, yes, you can. However, as we look at the contact tracing and where problems are, Mexico has some significant issues on COVID right now. Juarez, Mexico, is in a shutdown right now. Our county judge has put us into a shutdown, but what we have discovered from our public health department is where are all these spikes occurring? Well, approximately 3.5 weeks ago, I shut down our restaurant bars at 9 p.m. To close for in dining, and then said you had to you could do takeout. But what we found as we did a deep dive for a couple of weeks in October, we found that the majority of our spikes are coming from shopping in what we call the big box retailers, which are considered essential under CISA Homeland Security guidelines, and for which the state nor us locally have any control over limitations. We have talked to them corporately about limiting the number of visitors. Shopping in El Paso from a cultural standpoint is a family event. So we typically have families going out in droves to go shopping. And what we've tried to do is curtail that. We know if you're a single parent, you've got to take your children, but we're trying to limit that. So something like 36 or 37% of the positives were coming from there. And 20 some odd percentage were coming from, or about 20% were coming from visitation to Mexico. So that's still an issue for us. And then what we found out on the restaurants and the bars, so-called, was that when they were closed at 9, they weren't going home. They were congregating, and over 50% of our positives have come from those ages 20 to 39. So it's that group that feel like they're invincible, and they're out drinking, which causes you to let down your guard, et cetera. And then they go elsewhere to someone's home or another location, and they continue. So those are the issues we're dealing with. I don't believe, and I've had a bit of a disagreement with our county judge, that I don't believe the small businesses, the bookstores, the things like that have been shut down have anything to do with prolonging or causing the spread. And it's as harmful economically as it is physically from the virus. So that's kind of a quick overview of where we are, and we're still trying to get our arms around it. Our hospitals are at capacity, and we got some real challenges continuing.
Mayor Rees, I know that London recently entered a second shutdown, I think, or another shutdown. I can't keep track. I don't know what the situation is in Bristol. Can you tell us? And also maybe close with some thoughts and concerns or questions about how COVID is going to impact possibly the way we think about migration, where everything is even more closed now.
The whole country's just been put into lockdown. So last week, we were announced a 4-week national shutdown for England. So there's some consternation a little bit because we could have done it a couple of weeks earlier over school half-term break, which we think if we'd have gone in earlier, we wouldn't have had to have 4 weeks. We probably could have done 2. And I will say, actually, one of the points was raised earlier on, Bristol is one of the 10 biggest cities outside London, part of what we call the core cities. Our national government do not consult with us as a matter of routine on its policy, and it's not ideal. So you get a one-size-fits-all blanket policy. Now, there are occasions where that's necessary for minimal standards and a national expertise, but sometimes you have to listen to local leaders about the unintended consequences of what you're doing. And as Mayor Margo said, we said from the beginning that there are 2 health threats from this. There's the virus itself, and there's the health threat that comes from the undermining of the economy. Unemployment, inequality, poor housing loss all creates sickness and ultimately early death as well. So as the public health approach to this, not just a health service approach, but a public health approach, which I think is an important distinction to make, would have us on our toes about thinking about the by far and away this biggest determinant of population health is social factors. All right, and what we're doing is we're undermining some of our positive social forces as well. But the way COVID landed with migration is in a number of ways. One is, I think there was a growing appreciation of migrant workers because many of them were on our front line. They were practicing medics, be they doctors, nurses. They were on our social care services as well. A lot of European workers, European migrant workers are working in our care homes with older people who were continuing to go to work, a lot of them on the front line. So there was quite a strong narrative about, actually, we've got to value people who are keeping us running and taking care of our elders. And it was also clear that COVID exposed some of our underlying weaknesses and inequalities. I've just come off a call with World Economic Forum, and the mayor of Helsinki was saying that COVID exposed more than it's changed. And it's exposed some of those underlying fragilities in our society. My election was postponed for a year, for example. The system didn't hold up. But it exposed our inequalities. So people from migrant backgrounds who were poorer and poor people got COVID in disproportionate numbers and died in disproportionate numbers, particularly people from black and brown people in the UK. My real concern of COVID on the debate around migration and our approach to migration is going to be is in the economic depression that is now coming our way. I think during times of economic desperation, we're always at danger of desperate politics, and I'm very concerned. And we are making a deliberate effort to one is to get as much money spent in our economy as possible with our big green infrastructure projects, so we can promote jobs and offer some economic hope as people face economic hopelessness. But also to make sure that we are continuing with that narrative of we get through challenges together. We use a proverb in the city a lot. We don't despise our sufferings because suffering produces perseverance, character, hope. But the movement from suffering to perseverance isn't an automatic movement. You have to do it on purpose. I think it's true for individuals and true for collectives. So my hope is that if we do it on purpose, all the challenges we face now will actually become evidence of our city's resilience. But as I said, that's not going to be an automatic movement. That's going to take intentional quality leadership. I'm not saying I have it, but we've got some great people in the city who are committed to us making that journey.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. I think we're about on time here. So really appreciate this conversation. Lots of ground to cover and lots of things to consider as we go forward in this challenging time. So thank you so very much to both of you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.